I've obviously said this a lot. There's been a lot of this analysis on the left over the last few years of the way that a sort of superficial identity politics has been a stand-in for substantive economic politics among liberals because their base doesn't actually want them to change the economic status quo. The way they distinguish themselves from Republican is by saying, well, at least I like gay people and black people and Latinos and whatever. Now that is increasingly toxic, both because of well-founded criticisms from the left who see the emptiness in that kind of representational politics, and from criticisms from the right over the DEI stuff, et cetera, and just generally, being white supremacist. There seem to be doing a different pivot, and it almost feels to me like this focus on media and Joe Roganing yourself out of this and like TikToking yourself out of this. It feels like another placeholder that enables them to act like they're busy trying to fix the obvious problem of having lost this election without actually having to do anything substantive, which comes back again to your point, Hamid, about how the polls are just so clear. And if you even wanted to do straight popularism, which I agree isn't always, I don't think that every popular thing is the thing that we should do, because I am an independent person with morals, ethics, and values that aren't always shared by the masses. But like, even if you were to do straight popularism, it quite obviously would be like a net good over the Democratic Party's current policy stance, and infinitely more effective. You've listed all these stats, but the one that I'm sure you didn't list because it's so obvious at this point, but which I feel like we shouldn't drop, is the Medicare for All being supported by 88% of Democrats and almost 50% of Republicans and something like 66% of independents. It's like such a no-brainer. And we saw Joe Biden being chosen as the candidate in 2020 who ran on, I would veto it even if it managed to pass the House and the Senate. I want to come back to the dirtbag left of it all, though. Because while I don't think I was Chapo or any podcast responsibility to save America, I am really interested in the sort of spirit deflating reality of the moment that we live in that makes it feel almost impossible for there to be a resurgence of any kind, whether it's behind like a Bernie style person or whether it's kind of movement based, the way you describe Black Lives Matter as being Jake Flores. And it concerns me because I am someone who found Chapo back in 2016 or whenever it was in the first Bernie cycle and adored them. It felt like such a breath of fresh air. It felt so liberating to hear this mix of like humor and like cynicism, but mediated by a genuine optimism that the world could be better. And while I think that like the dirtbag left and sort of like alt political outlets, generally speaking, are really characterized by that cynicism, what made Chapo feel different, and a lot of shows in that moment feel so different, is that they were working toward a shared goal that they were genuinely optimistic about. And I want to come back to the article just for a second, and like set the stage for what this felt like. Chapo rode the wave of a resurgent electoral left in the wake of Bernie Sanders' first campaign, becoming the flagship media project of his movement. By March 2020, the podcast was the highest grossing podcast on Patreon and was bringing in $174,000 a month on the site. And their mission sharpened as Sanders prepared to run again. They urged listeners to travel to early primary states, to canvass for Sanders. Many in the more than 700 strong audience at their Iowa show on the night of the caucuses had crossed state lines. Quote, "What's crazy is that we're not just tossing out catharsis and jokes into the void," Biederman told them. "This is part of something real." Even then, they knew Sanders was up against a powerful Democratic Party machine. "Government and big business are coming after our movement, and they're coming strong, but they won't win because we are the biggest and most honest podcast in America," Menaker shouted to the crowd in Iowa City, mixing facetiousness with a measure of truth and genuine optimism. "Other than Joe Rogan," corrected Frost. "Looks like John Lovett's just another screenwriter now," said Biederman, calling out one of the co-hosts of Pod Save America, the rival show started by former Barack Obama aides that speaks to the Democratic Party establishment. Cut to after the 2020 loss. Super Tuesday 2020, when Joe Biden locked up the Democratic nomination, marked a turn for Chapo. "I felt like that was the chance for the left in this country to assert themselves politically through the electoral system, and it didn't work," Menaker, who is 41, tells me. "It revealed the actual purpose of the Democratic Party, which is to prevent something like that from happening." After that March, their Patreon earnings flatlined, not dropping precipitously, but never again rising with the same speed. The locus of the show's mission had spun out. "During the Bernie years, it was easy to evangelize to the audience," Frost tells me. "Without that, the second I realize someone is listening, it's a little more difficult." Without Bernie, it's harder to evangelize to the audience. That struck me because I don't necessarily feel that's true on my end. But I do come back to this point that you make, Jake, that maybe it is true if you sort of saw your evangelism coming through the path of electoral politics and a figure like Bernie uniquely.
Mhm. If that was the unique factor there, then that's how you get bummed out and doomery, I think. Um, Interesting moment, 2016, 2017. As someone who makes a little rinky-dink left podcast, I've had conversations a million times with the Anders, my co-host, and other people in this milieu about what the hell that was and whether it's ever going to happen again. And Trump got elected again, and it didn't happen again. And they're also outside of media. You didn't see the same thing reflected, like, for example, the boom in DSA membership that happened in
Mm-hmm.
2017, right? That tells a story, I think, which is that for whatever reason, the things were reaching critical mass, the heightened contradictions at the core of what it is to be an American at that time, who thought that you were like liberal, probably is how most people identified, even who are now leftists and stuff like that. People who thought that someone like Barack Obama was sort of the solution to a lot of these supposed problems. The horrifying realization that that maybe wasn't true and that there was more to this was like this mass break of consciousness. And I don't, that's a unique historical moment. It's not going to happen again because people didn't really go back to living in a fantasy haze that the Democrats are the good guys and that they're working to stop the Republicans. And that's how you end the Iraq war and close Guantanamo Bay and all this stuff. Historically, now people understand. I think if you talk to young people right now, you'll see a really interesting like nihilism or maybe even like an existentialism or something because they don't remind me of young me. Young me was hopeful. Young Zoomers now seem very aware that they're put into a situation where climate apocalypse might kill them and there's no future, and their politics are shaped accordingly. We don't have this big moment of hope anymore. But, for that reason, we have the long game here. We can't be short-sighted anymore. We have to build a long, boring project. And that's the only way to do this. And I think that's why the left isn't like trendy like it used to be, but it also hasn't gone away. It's just simply we've gotten away from a moment where you can hope to get a bunch of Patreon subs because everyone's talking about this thing. It's gone back to being a project. And as someone within this world that does this stuff, I think it's important to think about because I think that on some level, what we all do, right? Podcasters, influencers, pundits, artists, whatever, was kind of shaped in that era. The form of what we do was shaped by that like big jackpot of consciousness or whatever. And I think a lot of us kind of sought to do this thing where we tried to make a left-wing version of a right-wing thing. We tried to take a bourgeois professional career and go, what if you do that as a leftist? And it had some limits and it sort of ran up against some things. And now, there are some inherent contradictions there. And it's not bad. It's the terrain that we work in. But you start to see the way that you actually like the disinterest in spreading information might be a result of the fact that no one thinks you can get rich doing this anymore. And I think that
Well,
maybe
I
go
don't know if
ahead.
that's what the Chapos are saying. I mean, I have a criticism that
This
I'm
is
winding
not
up to
specific to Chapo.
about Chapo, but just as an or me or anybody like or not anybody. There is some of that. I'm not going to say there's not some of that, but I why would I want to push back? First, I would like to push back on the idea, the framing of it as a big, boring thing. I don't think it's a big, boring thing. I don't think that the absence of a Bernie campaign cycle means that I am bored by the current political moment and the opportunities that are presented within it. And I think one of the hopeful notes for me, and maybe a hopeful for the Chapos kind of regaining the kind of sort of energy that they had during the Bernie years, is a quote that they gave at the end, that which I really resonated with, about how they feel reinvigorated by the public upswell in support of Palestine. They wrote, The hosts retain their capacity to be astonished by the left's ability to unexpectedly rise. One of the most heartening things I've seen in my time doing the show came years after a very disheartening defeat for Bernie, says Biederman. For the first time in my life, seeing tens of thousands of Americans turning out for Palestine, it was probably the most amazing display I've seen. And I agree with that. And I do worry sometimes that some folks on the left will frame the project as necessarily taking hundreds of years or decades and necessarily being something that we're not going to see in our lifetimes, as a way, I think, to keep people from wanting to do quick fixes that aren't going to work. But sometimes I think that can be a sort of a demobilizing impulse. And I try to stay away from it. There are, months that happen in years and years that happens in months, or whatever the hell the quote is, that I can never get right. Like this is the, I tend to want to stay in that space. For me, what was demobilizing, and this is my wind up to my one good faith, really meant in nothing but like love and support, like criticism of Chapo, is that I felt them feel like Bernie was the vehicle. And I felt them kind of emotionally disengaged post Bernie. I don't think that was necessary to the reality of what it is to talk about left politics and podcasts. And for me, I actually agree with you on this, Jake. It felt to me like this kind of commitment to this sock dim approach, this kind of like over optimism about the squad, an unwillingness to criticize the squad for way longer than I think many other people on the left were. I remember the specific moment, sorry to do this, sorry, around Force the Vote, where they didn't talk about it, but very fleetingly on their show. And there was some background stuff, I think, happening about their separation with Virgil and how they might have felt about the bad faith being so forward on that particular issue. Mm-hmm. But they basically wrote it off. Like, this isn't a real thing. We're not going to talk about this. This isn't worth it. I don't want to overstate what they said because it was many years ago and I haven't re-listened to that episode in a long time. Maybe we'll put a clip in. But it was very perfunctory. And I think that was where the fight was. Those kind of flashpoints of real, genuine adversarial politics, those are the flashpoints that made Chapo great. Not Bernie per se, but the willingness to hop in difficult moments that were genuinely adversarial to the Democratic Party. And the doomerism, from my perspective, sets in on a lot of these other shows when you find yourself overly invested in the very sort of team that your brand or your kind of political identity was supposed to be adversarial to. Go ahead, get in there, Jake. What do you, and Hamid as well. I'm sorry, I don't mean to, I see you smiling over there.
Said a mouthful. Man. Okay, well, I gotta be honest with you. I wasn't really particularly into Force the Vote, but
I know you weren't, Jake.
But I think I think that we need to be able to have little debates and to self-criticize and stuff like that. And that's what makes the left, right? People always accuse the left of being like the circular firing squad. And if you're part of a group of people that are actively thinking about things, that's going to happen, right? If you're part of a group of people that try to avoid conflict by turning their brains off and feigning apolitical, that sort of thing, that's right-wing stuff, all right? So it's okay if we have different plans of attack here. And I'm sitting here covered in black denim telling you about mutual aid and stuff like that. So I have a way that I think things work, obviously, right? But like, I think that the big picture here is diversity of tactics, right? If you understand that none of us know the answer to the $1 million question. None of us know exactly how to solve a situation like America's, funding of Israel or our horrible economy or the fact that we don't have healthcare here. If you understand that, like, no one has 100% the answer to that, but we all on the left are trying all these different, approaches and stuff and drawing from historical traditions and stuff like that and experimenting, then I think you get a lot less anxiety about having these conflicts. And I also think you get a lot less anxiety about the fact that other people are just trying other stuff or doing other stuff or whatever. So I would say this should be like a little struggle session. This should be a little,
I would agree, but it didn't feel like a little struggle session. It felt a little bit like, and people can feel differently about this, but my emotional experience of that moment was that there was almost a like emotional investment in defending the squad as a group that people had worked toward, that the left had worked toward putting where they were. And the question, the second order question of, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing while they're there, was secondary to the sort of investment in having won, right? The left won and wasn't a loser because we had successfully gotten these people into Congress and the big boys club, and we for once weren't on the fringes, right? That's what it felt like. And that precluded, it seemed to me, a genuine engagement in like, well, how would this work? And you got a lot of misinformation where people were claiming that, what's his name? Kevin McCarthy was going to be Speaker of the House if people didn't vote for Nancy Pelosi, and all of this stuff that later proved to be untrue, right? Like it didn't later prove to be untrue, it was true in the moment.
Sure.
And people like Kyle Kalinske, who literally were part of the project to get these people elected in the squad to begin with, the Justice Democrats, were telling you that it wasn't true, and we're telling you that this was a good plan, and was being ignored when he was doing so at the time, right? Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. You look like you're about to say something.
I think you're bringing up an interesting concept here, which bears breaking down, in my opinion, which is the question of whether media plays a role in this sort of stuff. Because you often hear people in media sort of selectively, depending on the situation, whether it advantages them, declare themselves to be like political or just a reflection of politics, right? Often we get this thing, especially with leftists, you often get this orthodox sort of Marxist superstructure based thing where we go, we're just part of the superstructure. We just report on what's happening. Politics is not downstream from culture, right? Politics being downstream from culture is like a right-wing thing. They're always trying to influence culture to get people to support this or that. And it's interesting. I think it's a cycle, right? I think that we both report on things, but we also, like, what we're doing with these left-wing projects does affect things, as evidenced in the article where Biederman talks about how he's attached to a real thing and has a moment where it's probably kind of mind-blowing. I'm sure it was. But that's something to think about, I guess, that I would warn against having malaise over, is the idea that, by making this stuff, we are informing people. I've met a lot of people in left organizing shit who all fucking listened to Chapo, and that's where the first spark you had.
And to the article's point, there were real people, hundreds of people who came to Iowa to door knock because Chapo asked them to. I remember as National Press Secretary going on an episode of Chapo to help to boost and support those exact efforts because the campaign understood that they were genuinely moving people and that they had an enormous reach, and it was important.
So I would argue that that's a reason to keep doing this, even if we're not all going to get super rich off of it the same way we did last.
Well, certainly that shouldn't be the goal.
I think it also plays into what you're saying with Force the Vote, because Force the Vote seemed to be a thing that was coming out of the media. It was like a project that a lot of, I remember all these different pundits talking about it, and I remember thinking, did this come from somewhere? Like, was there a campaign to make this a thing? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there was, but it seemed like
what media was it coming out of? Because it was a discrete group. It was some big voices.
I'm trying not to get too messy here, but it was like, I remember you and like Jimmy Dore and people like that talking about it, and I think it's okay.
People like that. Well,
I think it's okay.
I heard it first from Sam Cedar.
Okay, fair enough.
Who had heard it on Jimmy Dore and said it was a good idea. And knowing the acrimony between the two of them, I at the time didn't really listen to Jimmy Dore, not for any particular reason. I just didn't. And remember going over from Sam Cedar, who I did listen to hear more about it, because I said it must be a good idea if Sam Cedar is willing to give flowers to Jimmy Dore. And only after, we talked about this on Bad Faith Podcast. Maybe we'll put this clip in when we had Sam Cedar on to discuss it after the moment had passed. He acknowledged that he had gotten a phone call, and you can read into this however you'd want to, from somebody on, I believe, somebody's staff, congressional staff from the squad, that told him that they weren't interested and that basically he should lay off of the issue. So it seemed to me that quite the opposite. It was very much a grassroots idea that Jimmy Dore had seen it. It was from the DSA playbook, this idea of forcing the vote, from like some 2018 strategy write-up. That he had seen it, saw that there was potential in it because of the composition of Congress at the time being such a slim majority for Democrats in the House, slim enough that the progressives could be dispositive in their vote and withholding their vote for Nancy Pelosi as speaker, that there were no downsides, right? Because it's just a speaker vote. There's no legislation. No one's COVID vaccines or social security checks are being thwarted as a result of this. And it seemed like a no-brainer. But this is
I don't mean it as a critique when I say that it was something that seemed to take shape through like podcasts and YouTube shows and stuff like that. I mean, that's good. That shows you that our little corner of like alt media potentially has a role to play in getting something like that across the board. I just don't think it happened. That's all. That's my only.
well, it didn't happen, and this is my point. Like I did feel like I remember being, you know, disappointed, I guess, at this moment when I heard, Chapo, which is like, I do think the bravest. What did that quote I just read? The bravest and most honest show on the left, or whatever they said at the Iowa conference. I think that that's true, right? And the brave thing, for me, obviously this is subjective. I think the brave thing in the moment might be to say, even if you hate Jimmy Dore's guts, this is a good idea and a once in a generation opportunity for the left to actually use the power that it has, that we've worked so hard for it to have by fighting for them to get into all of these positions across the country and getting this group called the Squad in office in the first place, to actually get some concessions for the left in a Biden administration that is patently disrespectful to the left. And as we saw over the next 4 years, did nothing but give its middle finger to the middle left and the ultimate middle finger to the left. And as a consequence, lost an election. And now we're sitting in the middle or the beginning of a new Donald Trump term. And it's hard for me, especially in retrospect. I mean, I just sat down a couple of weeks ago with Joshua Citarella to do an episode of his show. And I was very surprised when he opened by basically saying, "Oh, this is the year Brianna was proven right about everything." I was like, "Oh, Lordy, I'm not used to anybody ever saying that to me." I got a little tongue-tied because I'm used to having to fight this case over and over again. But I do, frankly, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be self-aggrandizing here, but I do think that it is very hard to make the argument against an alternative kind of an approach when we saw 4 years of Biden beating up on the left, the consequence of this election, and all of the stats and material that people like Hamid are bringing to the foreground that shows that we could have had a different way, and that maybe in our limited capacity as left pundits should have been fighting harder for that to be a litmus test for our support for folks and not telling people to vote for Genocide Joe and Holocaust Harris, for example.
I think
Go ahead, Hamid.
The time period of 2020 and 2021, both for, we'll say, I think the left, like outside the Democratic Party, and progressives within the Democratic Party, I think is something that should be kind of analyzed, because in theory that is the moment we're working toward again, right? We're thinking about, okay, Trump is obviously going to be president for 4 years, but at some point in the future, there's going to be a Democratic president again, and there's going to be a Democratic trifecta, and we're actually going to be able to pass policy. There should be these kind of conversations happening over what angle do progressives take in that kind of a coalition? Were the right steps taken in 2020 and 2021, 2022 to really flex the power that we had? And were people too conciliatory toward the Biden administration, especially given what happened? That's obviously hindsight 2020, but by the end of the Biden administration, there really didn't seem to be much advantage of being attached to that president. People were kind of in droves fleeing and trying to disconnect themselves from him. Even like down ballot candidates who were running for Senate, who were not leftists by any means, more center left and moderate candidates, but they don't want to be associated with them. But the progressives really hitched their wagons to Biden in those first 2 years of his term. And I think there's a question of when we have this moment again, whenever that is, and it seems a little bit hopeless, like, is that going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now that we actually have a trifecta again? What will our orientation be? I do want to bring up, I think one thing that's really interesting, and the conversation here has been so interesting for me to listen to, because it reminded me of something that I hadn't thought about in years, which was, Brianna, you and I obviously worked on the Bernie 2020 campaign. When I was talking to folks about the possibility that he'd run again, I remember someone told me the reason that this race is important, or the reason it's important that he runs again, is because the presidency is like nothing else in American politics. Like, you can get a member of Congress elected, and then they are one of 145 people who have to, deal with all these internal politics. You get a senator elected, that's still 1 out of 100 people that have to deal with all these internal politics. It's hard. But the presidency is like a real thing that you can go and win. And you win it, you have power. And the way to win it is get 51% in a Democratic primary and then get 51% in a general election. And suddenly this whole thing opens up. And there's all this now, the way the media works too, there's so much national attention behind that. And I think that's something that we can, again, reading this Vanity Fair article, I'm thinking about who can build that energy for a future presidential run, who we can maybe, steal our way to the top a little bit. And actually, from there, you can make real change. You have a bully pulpit. You have someone who's really able to just break through in a way that no one else can. So I do think that that's, as we're thinking of the next 4 years, it's a long time from now, obviously, until the next Democratic primary. But that's something that the left needs to think about, is like, we need to be ready to really like flex our power in the next race and see if we can recreate what we had in 2016 and 2020, but this time actually get over the finish line. One thing that we're talking about is like, oh, the left feels defeated. We feel like there's no energy. One thing that's different about this year than, frankly, there was even in 2017 is that if you see the moderate Democratic Party as oppositional, they're also feeling this way. There's no leader there. Obama kind of held a sphere of influence, even going into the 2020 election, where he could make a real impact on that by seemingly telling candidates to drop out and endorse one person all at once. I don't know if there's a person within the Democratic Party who has that kind of influence anymore. It seems like, I don't think President Biden is going to be very influential going forward in politics. I can't imagine that being the case.
Yeah, well, I'm just worried this man isn't going to make it to the spring. I mean, honestly. And then we have Nancy Pelosi, who's genuinely powerful, cracking out a walker on the floor of Congress. Like, I'm really not trying to be glib. I'm not trying to be ageist. Bernie's old, but he's still with it and running up and down escalators. But there is a gerontocracy problem. And Hakeem Jeffries, who, I'm sorry, during the Force the Vote, everyone was telling me that was the most evil, Machiavellian, even worse than Pelosi mastermind, and we couldn't end up with him being speaker. It seems as dense as a bag of doornails as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not he obviously isn't up to the task of filling the leadership void. He's just out here quoting Jay-Z lyrics, living his best life, it seems. So yeah, there is a leadership void that I agree with you, Hamid, we could be exploiting right now.
The weird thing, though, is like, I do want to touch on the Fetterman stuff that's coming out.
Please, I'd love for you to.
This is kind of what exemplifies, again, the party, the people who seem to be operating strong levers within the Democratic Party, talking to media, getting voices out there. The fact that they think that Fetterman is the solution to their problems, and he's been thrown out. I remember watching within 24 hours of the election night loss in November, Chuck Todd was on NBC News saying, I'm getting phone calls and people are saying, hey, here's the kind of candidate we need to run in the future, and named John Fetterman. And there's an article today in Puck News about, Democratic sources say, this is the guy that Democrats need in the future.
Let me set you up, Hamid. We actually have a clip of the author of that Puck article talking about this on CNN. So maybe we'll play this here, and then I'll let you respond to it and use that as a sort of a hook so the audience sort of knows what we're talking about.
One person that we were talking about that has also tried to ingratiate themselves with the White House, maybe not ingratiate, but has met with them and certainly made the tributes, is John Fetterman, a Democratic senator from Pennsylvania who Trump very much did not want to win that Senate race. You have some reporting on how people are kind of turning to him, or certain Democrats who maybe feel rudderless. What have you heard?
Yeah, it's just that John Fetterman sort of offers like an authentic type of like bro masculinity that matches what Donald Trump was offering this election cycle. He's also a moderate from a state that the Democrats lost, and he speaks his mind. He speaks like from off the cuff authentically. He sounds like Donald Trump. He's not willing to buck the party and establishment in the same way that Donald Trump was willing to buck the party party and the establishment and create the party in his own way. Sure, the base doesn't really love Fetterman a lot, and I think that's why you hear a lot of conspiracies that he's going to be a Republican, but he just might be the guy that Democrats need right now when they don't have a unified leader who can just speak plainly in Trump's speak against him. He's the kind of guy who would go on Joe Rogan and really hold his own, and the Democrats don't have that person right now.
I'm losing my mind.
Dying. Yeah.
I'm losing my mind. He's the kind of guy who could go on Joe Rogan. Ma'am, I'm sorry, we all know what I'm about to say. Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan and they all hated it. Also, Joe Rogan was a Bernie Sanders voter. He was Bernie Sanders curious. He was left curious. You guys did this to themselves. Also, he's articulate. He bucks the party. How? By just wanting to literally become a Republican? Isn't that at the rumor mill that we're days or weeks from him announcing that he's switching parties? Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.